Somebody's got to get the conversation started. How about if we just start? Arrow.net, ARROE.net. We are unplugged and totally uncut with Mark Follman.
Good morning. I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
Fantastic. I wish we could have met under different circumstances instead of after, we've had 2 shootings now by 18-year-olds, and that really is in my soul very deeply.
Yeah. Yes, it's just a devastating week, especially after what we just saw in Texas. Just horrific. And I say that as a journalist who is deeply invested in this, studying and writing about this problem, but also as a parent of 2 kids. I grieve for those families and that community in Texas, as I know all of America is right now.
Not just America, the world. I was shocked by the stuff that I've been reading about how the world has reacted.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to something important here, too, that in some ways our society has become desensitized to this problem. Certainly not in the immediate aftermath of this horror. I mean, it's so traumatic and terrible. And I know people are angry and upset throughout the country. And yet we seem to have sort of accepted this idea in some ways that this will just go on and on. We're resigned to this notion of helplessness, or this idea that nothing will ever change. We see a lot of that in the media and political narratives around mass shootings. And I think that's just wrong. I just wrote a new piece this morning in Mother Jones arguing against this, that we need to start to really see this problem in a different light. That begins with recognizing the reality of what it is. And there are a lot of big myths that we recycle about mass shootings. I take that on in the book, in Trigger Points, talking about how we misunderstand how these attacks occur and what leads up to them, and what we can do about them.
Did it shock you that the guy that was in New York that shot up the store, that he was doing it on live stream? It's like, okay, something's really wrong if we have to take it to live stream. And those that were watching, are they not part of the, they should be held accountable as well?
It's profoundly shocking that a person would do that. And it is also a measure of the world in which we live now, in the media environment and the use of digital media, social media, by everyone. And so in that sense, in a certain fundamental way, we all have a stake in this. I don't know the answer to the question of whether or not there is criminal liability for people who were privy to what he was going to do before he did it. There's actually really disturbing reporting coming out about this now. The Buffalo News just reported late yesterday that a former federal agent, not identified publicly, may have been aware of what he was going to do in Buffalo, had been a part of this chat room that he apparently set up just ahead of the attack and made it accessible to people. So there's something going on here that is very disturbing. Mm-hmm. But the issue of this problem in our society is complex and big and requires, I think, a much bigger response in terms of how we understand it and take it on. This is not just about debating gun laws. Obviously, that is fundamental to this problem. We have an enormous amount of firearms in our country. They're easy to get, but there's a lot more going on here, too.
You make it very clear inside Trigger Points that these mass shooters don't suddenly snap, that there is a paper trail. And I don't understand why those paper trails are ignored. Yeah,
well, I think it's important to say that this is not easy work, and right. And identifying who does this and how is always easier in hindsight. But the good news is that there is a discernible process that leads up to these attacks. There are patterns of behaviors and circumstances that experts in the field of threat assessment have studied for a long time. And this is what I focus on in the book, documenting these cases and embedding and immersing with threat assessment teams who do this work. And I tell those stories, looking at individuals of concern who are raising alarm, and how these teams go about identifying and evaluating what the issues are with them, and then coming up with a plan to intervene constructively to try to manage the person and help steer them away from violent thinking and planning. That's the nature of what happens in all of these cases. And in the aftermath, the public and the press and our political system all kind of tries to glom on to these simplistic explanations for what happened. Blame it all on mental illness, as if these are all just crazy monsters who just snap impulsively. No, none of that is true. That's not what happens in these cases. Blame it just on the debate over guns. Well, we see where that's gotten us over the last 20 years. So, we really need to understand this problem for what it is. And that's really what I try to do, the story that I try to tell in Trigger Points, and particularly in terms of constructive work to try to diminish these attacks.
I just had this conversation with my sister, and she just did not buy into it. And I tried to explain to her, we all have some sort of mental illness, and we've all got to become more open about it. And she debated that like you would not believe. But it's situations where we don't know who's going to go next, or what's going to happen at work, at a church. I mean, walking through life with fear is not the way we're supposed to be living.
No, that's very true. And the way that you frame it is interesting. I do think, though, what you're pointing at is really important here, because in some ways we run up against the limits of lay understanding and lay language with mental illness and mental health issues. Blaming mass shootings on mental illness fundamentally is wrong. It's factually wrong. And I've written about this a lot recently, and I write about it in the book. All mass shooters are not crazy monsters who snap. That's a myth. At the same time, mental health is often an important part of these cases. These are people who have serious problems. They're depressed. They're angry. They aren't functioning well. They're deteriorating personally through any number of life circumstances, in their home life, in school, in jobs. And at the same time, there is in these cases often a long organized process of thinking, of rational thinking and planning, and a decision. They decide to do this attack. So we can recognize and acknowledge that people who commit mass shootings, of course, are not mentally healthy people, but we can't dismiss them as entirely unrelatable, as crazy, as inexplicable evil. I mean, these are emotional responses to the horror, and that's understandable to have that response, but that is not helpful to understanding the nature of the problem and doing more to stop it.
What's really interesting is, and I would love to see the research on this, and I love to dig just like you like to dig. I would love to see what is happening with the way the media just over-sensationalizes every single story. I'm going to tell you, Mark, is there a war in Ukraine anymore? Because if you look at CNN or any of those other ones, you would never think it.
Yeah, well, I think this is another important facet of this issue in America, the way that we frame mass shootings. You're right that it's completely taken over. I think with good reason right now, given the incredible, horrific event that has happened in Texas. I mean, a massacre of school children. How does this happen, right? We need to pay attention to this. We're back at Sandy Hook all over again, 10 years later. It's fundamentally disturbing. Another disturbing thing, though, is that it kills me when these senators or these lawmakers are showing up in these pictures holding a gun. I'm going, you're doing the wrong message here, people. I'm sure that's not what we're supposed to be doing. Yeah. I very explicitly work to get beyond the gun debate and gun politics with the book, because we all are extremely familiar with all of that. And for me, the question really became, what more can we do about this? This can't be the only way at it. But you're right. We tend to still fixate on that in our media and our politics, with sensationalism and with polarized arguments. And, it's an important argument to have. This is a crucial policy in a country with 400 million guns that are very easy to get in a lot of places. But that being said, there's nothing simple about this problem. There's no simple solution to it. It's going to take many different forms of action to improve the situation. And I argue that includes this prevention work of behavioral threat assessment, that we develop more community-based teams that do this work. And there are a lot of them around the country. This is actually now required in public schools in a handful of states. This is a new development in the last few years, and suggests that this is an important growing policy. And some of the gun regulations on the table as well, that are, I think, very directly connected. One being so-called red flag laws, these extreme risk protection orders, right, that are a civil tool to remove firearms temporarily from people who are raising concerns about danger to themselves or to other people, or both in a lot of these cases. A lot of mass shootings are suicidal massacres. So we can understand that better, and we can do more to intervene before it's too late.
You brought up schools. My God, Mark, the numbers in Charlotte alone of guns in school, it's through the roof. And I remember the days when you would go to school with a band's guitar pick, and that's how you found your stature. It just seems like that it's a changed world. I've got a gun. Oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it speaks to a number of things that have continued to develop in our country. One being, of course, the record number of firearms that are easily available. I think that in some ways our media culture and social media have driven this problem. We see a lot of this activity on social media, especially among young people, posting pictures of guns, getting their hands on guns, bringing guns to school. I would argue, too, that there's a certain theme of resignation to this problem in our culture and in our politics, and that's recycled through media. I mean, look, media reflects what the public is thinking and doing in a lot of ways, right? So I also think it's simplistic to blame the media, but we are stuck in this narrative that, oh, there's nothing we can really do about this. Nothing ever changes. It's hopeless. I understand why people feel that way right now after this horrific event in Texas. But I don't agree with that. I think that in a way we are validating this form of violence as endless. And, kids are going to notice that and pick up on it too.
Dude, as somebody who works the social media, you show up on any of my pages with a picture of a gun and you're disconnected immediately. And boy, the trollers on me, they come after me because, they feel like they have the right to show their guns. And it's like, well, not on my sites, you're not. And do we need more of this?
Well, look, in my view, that what you're describing is exacerbated by the politics. And there are a lot of political leaders and elected officials who choose to exploit the polarization over guns and gun rights as a way of getting and retaining power, political power. And I think that's extremely unhelpful with this problem. We can have a reasonable discussion about gun rights and access to guns. But when people exploit that for fear and demagoguery and, tell the population that, the political enemy is going to take your guns away, and if you don't have your guns, the world's going to fall apart, it's fueling grievance, and it's fueling a sense of rage and despair. And these are factors that fuel this problem. Extremism fuels this problem. That is a rising issue. I've talked to many threat assessment experts about this recently, and for the book, they're concerned. This is a growing dynamic in our society. And I think it's no coincidence that we're seeing an escalation of these kinds of attacks.
Yeah. One of the things that I felt in reading Trigger Points is the fact that you have reached beyond the headlines and you are taking us into an area of personal growth. This is a tool. You know that, right?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that's fascinating about this field of work is that it's so little known, even now. I had been studying mass shootings for almost a year intensively before I even heard about it a decade ago. And yet it's existed for 40 years. So part of what I do in Trigger Points is tell the story of how this method was developed. It's quite fascinating to me that the Secret Service and experts in behavioral science and mental health got together in the 1980s to try to figure out what more they could do to prevent assassinations, coming out of that era of great turmoil and violence with political assassinations, MLK, Bobby Kennedy, John Lennon's murder, Ronald Reagan. These events were driving an intense interest in figuring out what more can we do to get in the way of planned violence. That's what this is. And that has a lot to do with what mass shootings are, and also celebrity stalking in the 1980s, workplace violence. You may recall the era of going postal when we had all the post office shootings. So all of this in nature is the same problem. And the people who pursued this collaboration with mental health expertise and law enforcement expertise, learn some really interesting things about the behavioral process leading to these attacks. These are not all crazy monsters who just snap. These are planned acts of violence that the planning takes place over a long period of time in many cases, and there are warning signs. And that is opportunity. That is opportunity to intervene constructively before it's too late.
You really put you pinpoint on something here that really has my attention, and I want to study it even more. Behavioral threat assessment. That right there is something that says you need to study this and you need to figure it out. What the real message is here.
Yeah, it's a really interesting field of work. It's about human behavior, and there's a certain evocative sense from that is I think it sounds complicated and maybe daunting and a little bit ominous, talking about mitigating threats and preventing violence. But that's what it's all about. And at the same time, it is constructive in its core intent. This is prevention work. It's not prediction. It's not trying to profile who the next mass shooter is. That's impossible. That's a myth. It's not dragnet surveillance of social media and Big Brother and that kind of approach to trying to profile or do pre-crime. That's the stuff of dystopian science fiction. This is about primarily getting people help who need help and recognizing that earlier in the process. And there's a lot of possibility for that that teams doing this work are carrying out. I tell the stories in the book of teams doing it in a school system, doing it in workplaces. There's a lot of work of this nature being done at the FBI with a special team at the Behavioral Analysis Unit that offers resources nationally when communities seek help with threat cases. So we don't hear about this much because when these cases are handled with good outcomes, there's no news. Because there's no violence. And that is the definition of success in this field. And it's tricky. It's tricky to show that because you're showing something that didn't happen, right? So how do you do that? But I've looked at a lot of these cases and I chronicle them in detail in the book, that's showing how you have people who are setting up for very scary situations over a period of time, taking steps to plan violence, thinking about violence, becoming fixated on it, giving off a number of warning signs through threatening communications, deteriorating personally in various ways. And there's a very distinct sense that if an intervention of this kind had not taken place and been sustained, these are people who would have gone on to commit horrific acts of violence, almost certainly.
I've got to see the research on this recent shooting in Texas because because my wife is a school teacher. We have talked about this over and over again. She wanted to know, how did this guy get through the door? Only to find out he went through the back door. Well, we all know what's going on in the back. That right there is your cafeteria crew. Those are your janitors. Somebody left the back door wide open, and this kid knew it.
Yeah, but again, talking about security, physical security, target hardening, reactive responses to this problem, it's important to have security in public places and in school. But we're not going to turn our society into armed fortresses, or I don't think we want to. And there's no evidence to suggest that that's going to effectively stop this, because we've been taking steps like that for 2 decades. Yep. That's been the emphasis since Columbine in 1999. And, we have to ask ourselves, do we want to have our schools locked down all the time? Do we want to have more police, more surveillance? Do we want to subject our children to active shooter drills? There's evidence now that causes anxiety and depression.
It does.
And so, none of that is going to prevent this anyway. It may mitigate some loss of life to have measures in place, but we need to do more to get in front of this. That is my view, and especially in studying this field of work.
You talk about that anxiety. You're absolutely right, because my wife spoke of that, of the way that the kids, they would practice and practice, and kids would cry in class. And you're right. It does things. My own neighbor says, do you know what it was like to grow up in this time period? I feared for my life every day. So, yeah, they're very much aware of it. But I got to ask you, Mark, I have a very good friend that took pictures. His job was to take the photos at murder scenes and stuff like that. The guy went insane. How, with all the investigating that you're doing, are you keeping it straight and forward and not going insane?
That's an interesting question. I as an investigative journalist, I think there's always a sense of mission in what we do. And initially, I became very interested in understanding this problem better because I just wasn't willing to accept the idea that it was inexplicable and unsolvable. And then when I learned about this work, yes, it took me down a road into some very dark places in terms of the material, but I always felt that, there was real purpose in studying it and that this was a potential additional solution that we could use in this country much more. And I got to know leaders in the field, and there are some extraordinary people doing this work in school systems, at the FBI, and elsewhere, who, I came to see as people who are optimistic. And maybe that's part of the answer here too. At my core, I'm an optimistic person. I believe we can do better. Yep. I think if you don't feel that way, you can't stare at this stuff all the time and try to dig into it. And the people who are doing this prevention work are the real heroes, in my view. I mean, they're doing incredible work to stop a lot of this and to help people who need help.
Wow. Mark, you got to come back to this show anytime in the future. The door is always going to be open for you, sir.
Thanks so much. I appreciate talking with you.
Well, I appreciate the fact that you've given us trigger points because, like I said, this is a tool. This needs to be used as a tool, and I hope that people grow forward from it.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Thanks for having me on.
You bet. Be brilliant today.
Cheers.